Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for our educational series, Ask Me. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Hang tight, and we'll be right back. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. We're going to be getting started in just a minute. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for Ask Me, our educational webinar series. My name's Audra Hines, Vice President of Care Services for the Golden West chapter of the ALS Association. And I want to start by thanking all of our generous sponsors who make programs like this one possible. Now we'll hear from one of these sponsors, Team Select Home Care.
At Team Select, we strive to provide the best possible patient care, which is why we have an elite team of internal case managers that help onboard and train our wonderful nurses that dedicate their time to work with our patients. We provide skilled nursing services staffed with both LVNs and RNs to both pediatric and adult patients. Our nurses follow our structured plan of care that is developed for each individualized patient with the help of their own physicians. Our staff provides total patient care, including activities of daily living, enteral tube feedings, both tracheal and oral suctioning, ventilator care, and much, much more.
Team Select covers Southern California and partners with our Golden West chapter in 3 of our branches: Diamond Bar, Los Angeles, and our newest Temecula branch. These offices serve individuals and families in San Bernardino County, Los Angeles County, and Riverside County.
We are proud to support our local ALS chapter. Please join us in support of the Golden West chapter's walk in October. Reach out to us for more details.
Thanks for that. Thanks to Team Select. There's so much information and misinformation out there about treatments and therapies for ALS, including some that may or may not provide symptom management or relief for people living with the disease. The Golden West chapter of the ALS Association is committed to providing the most accurate and up-to-date information on ALS research, clinical trial opportunities, effective symptom management strategies, and proven ways of increasing quality of life. We offer resource guides that are topic specific that help families understand how to best manage the disease process. Our ALS 101 educational videos are easily available through our website, and webinars like this one tonight are provided to all of you in order to allow you the opportunity to hear directly from professionals who are most knowledgeable in their subject area. It's critical to have the resources you need when you need them, and knowing that you can trust that it's accurate and current information. Please visit our website at alsagoldenwest.org for more information about the programs, services, and resources we offer to everyone in our ALS communities. In an effort to provide information and answer your questions on alternative therapies for ALS, we invited a very special speaker to join us tonight. Dr. Richard Bedlack holds MD and PhD degrees in neuroscience. He's currently an associate professor of medicine and neurology at Duke University. He's director of the Duke ALS Clinic and chief of neurology at the Durham VA Medical Center. He has won awards for teaching and for patient care, including Best Neurology Teacher, Healthcare Hero, Strength, Hope, and Caring Award, and several Patient Advocate of the Year awards. He's received research grants, participated in clinical trials, and published more than 70 articles. And he's leader of the International ALS Untangled program, which utilizes social networking to investigate alternative and off-label treatment options for people with ALS. Dr. Bedlack, we're so happy to have you with us tonight, all the way from East Coast time, and we so appreciate you being here. I'm going to let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Audra. It's wonderful to be with you. I sure wish I could be there in person. California is one of my favorite places to visit, but I'm channeling my inner Californian here, poolside with my crazy orange and blue shirt on.
We love it. We love it. You're perfectly decked out for this. Thank you so much.
Sure. Let's see if I can just make this a slideshow for you. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about alternative and off-label treatments and a program that I started to help patients make some sense of those called ALS Untangled. I always like to start off with my disclosures. I do have some research support from the ALS Association and also from Orion, Medicine Nova, and the Healy Center. And I've got consulting support from several companies, AB Science, ALS Association, Alexion, Amylyx, Apellis, Biogen, Brainstorm, Clean, Corcept, Genie, Guidepoint, Nubiotic, and Woolsey. What I do for these companies is mainly help them design protocols that I think are going to be more attractive and easier for people with ALS to participate in. So all of you out there listening know that people living with ALS, and I would imagine any other disabling, life-shortening illness, often consider trying alternative and off-label treatments that they find on the internet. Shown on this slide are just some of the many thousands of alternative and off-label treatments that are out there advertising themselves for ALS. Unfortunately, internet information about these kind of treatments is not always complete, and in fact, not always even accurate. And that can lead to an overestimate of the potential benefits of these kinds of things, as well as an underestimate of potential risks. And there are risks, even amongst AOTs advertising themselves as perfectly safe. We have found financial harms. Some of these treatments cost hundreds, some cost thousands, some cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. There are physical harms. We have found numerous infections, blood clots, deaths in clinics advertising themselves as perfectly safe. One of the most dramatic types of harms that's been found happens to people who are practicing something called stem cell tourism, going to other countries and paying large sums of money to be injected with what they're told are stem cells. And there are now numerous examples of those people coming back home and over the next few months developing cancer. And when the cancer is biopsied, it's found to be comprised of someone else's cells. In other words, these folks spent lots of money to be injected with cancer cells in these other countries. And then maybe one of the more subtle but important types of harms is scientific harms. And this has to do with enrollment rate. So as many of you may know, we do not enroll very fast in our ALS trials. We enroll about 2 patients per site per month in our trials. And busy centers like mine will typically see about 80 patients in a month, and 2 will enroll in clinical trials. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this. First of all, there's not nearly enough trials. Second, the trials that we have very narrow inclusion criteria, at least most of them do. So a lot of patients don't qualify. Third, the trials have a lot of unattractive design features. They may have a placebo, which some patients don't want to take the chance of getting. They may require a lot of in-person visits, which can be difficult. It may be a long time between when a person enrolls in a trial and when they get results, sometimes years. But certainly one of the reasons that people say no to clinical trials is that they decide instead to pursue AOTs that they read about on the internet. And so frustrated by all this, in 2009, I stood up at a meeting and I invited my colleagues around the world to help me design a program that I was going to call ALS Untangled. And I had this goal that we would work together to help people living with ALS make more informed decisions about these types of treatments. And from the beginning, I wanted to have three parts to this: inputs, where we get our ideas; reviews, how we would actually investigate those ideas; and outputs, how we would get what we learned back out to the people who asked about it. And we've evolved since those early days. We've now got everything that we do organized around a relatively new website, which is www.alsuntangled.com or .org or .net. We still get our inputs from patients and from families affected by this disease. And now those come in through face-to-face visits with one of the ALS Untangled team members, or they can come in through emails. My email is on the website. It's all over the internet. And it's a rare day that somebody doesn't email me some idea that they have that they read about on the internet as a possible treatment for ALS. So we now have over 400 ideas, which we've listed on the future reviews section of our website. We have so many great ideas that I've realized I'm probably not going to get to review all these in the course of my lifetime. And so we've had to come up with some way to prioritize these. And we actually do it in two parts. The most important part are the votes. So anybody can just go onto our website and vote for the AOT, the alternative or off-label treatment that they're most interested in, just by clicking on the button next to the name of that treatment. And you'll see that it gets one more vote when you do that. Now, you can't vote more than once for the same treatment, ideally. But the other way that we've had to incorporate is a multiplier. And that has to do with how much useful disclosable information we can find about a particular alternative or off-label treatment. Because no matter how many votes something gets, if we can't find any useful disclosable information, we can't write about it. So that would get multiplied by 0 in that case. Most of the things that people have asked for are multiplied by 1 because there's at least some information out there that we can find. And some of these things are multiplied by 2 because there's published trials or case series in which people, either with ALS or other diseases, were exposed to that treatment. And we get a lot of information from those kinds of publications. In terms of how we do the reviews, well, we couldn't find anyone else doing this in any other field. And I honestly still have not seen anyone in any other field trying to do something like this. And so we kind of had to invent a way to do it. And we started by building a team. Initially, there was a handful of us that wanted to work on this. And now the team has really grown. There's more than 100, actually more than 120 clinicians and scientists from across 11 different countries who are working on this together. And we have invented something that we call standard operating procedures, SOPs, that guide everything we do, from how we gather information to how we write the first draft, how we crowdsource it across the whole team, and ultimately how we publish it. And all these SOPs revolve around something that we invented called the table of evidence, and that's shown on this slide. So the basic idea here is that we want to know about 5 different things for each AOT, 5 different categories. The first is mechanistic plausibility. What is this thing supposed to do? And does that make any sense based on what we know about the laws of physics and what we know about the biology of ALS? The second is preclinical models. Was this thing ever given to any recognized model of ALS, a cell model, an animal model, etc.? The third is case reports. What are people living with ALS who tried this saying about it? The fourth is trials. Was this ever in any kind of trial for people with ALS? And then finally, risks. What kind of bad things could happen to someone who tries this treatment? And within each of these 5 categories, we assign a letter grade ranging from A to F. And just like back in school, you want to shoot for A's, F is not good. But you get a better grade based on the amount of evidence that we can find in that particular category. So let's use an example. If we take the category of case reports, if I find one person on the internet who says they have ALS and says they tried that particular treatment and had a benefit from it, that gets a D. If I can actually contact that person and get them to send me their medical records and read those records and agree with the diagnosis and agree that there's some objective evidence of benefit, you get a C. And if there's more than one person like that, you get a B. And if there are multiple people like that published in peer-reviewed articles, then you get an A. So that's basically how it works. So once we have a draft of an article, we send it out to the whole team. That's our crowdsourcing approach. Everybody gets 2 weeks to read it and send me their comments, and I try to incorporate everybody's comments into a draft. That draft then gets sent to the journal, ALS and Frontal Temporal Degeneration, which is really the main scientific journal in the ALS field. And it gets one last peer review from someone who's not on our team. If there's any comments from that reviewer, those get incorporated into the final draft, and then it gets published. And all of our articles are published by something called free open access, which means that nobody ever has to pay to read one of these articles. They're also published on our website under the completed reviews section of the website. You will find the names of 62 different AOTs that we've written about. If you want to read the whole article, you just simply click on the name of the thing you're interested in and it will open up an article. If you just want to see the grades that we gave it across those 5 categories, that's what all those letters mean. So you'll notice that some of these AOT names have stars next to them. That's because this program is now 12 years old. And some of the things that we wrote about 12 years ago have new information that has caused us to change our grades. And so we are periodically going in and trying to update some of our older reviews. And if there's an update, then that means there's a star next to that name. We've also recognized that not everybody likes to read their information. Some people like to listen to it in 2021. And so we've partnered with something called the CREATE Consortium, which is an NIH rare disease clinical research network centered at the University of Miami, to do podcasts. And these podcasts involve a person living with ALS who asks me questions about a particular alternative or off-label treatment. So it's basically just an interview, and we try to keep them between 5 and 10 minutes, and we try to keep them targeted at a non-scientific audience. So hopefully there's not a lot of jargon in there that's hard to understand. And so you can see those podcasts on the CREATE website, or we also have them on the Apple Podcast website, and you can listen to them there for free. And finally, we're learning that people in other countries are also very interested in AOTs. And so not all of them speak English well. And so thankfully, we're starting to partner with groups, and some of these are now being translated into other languages. So this is a tremendous amount of work. There's nothing that I've ever worked on harder in my life than this particular program. There's not been really a single day I can think of in the last 12 years that I haven't been working on ALS Untangled, whether it's reading one of the articles on an AOT, or writing a draft, or perusing some medical records, or trying to contact someone on the internet. Each one of these 62 reviews is about 40 hours worth of work. It's fair to say, is this really worth it? I mean, is this any kind of success? Well, I can definitely tell you that people are reading these reviews. So the journal keeps track of its most downloaded reviews in history. It's got a running list of the top 10 most downloaded reviews. We currently have 8 of the top 10 most downloaded reviews in the history of that journal, including all of the top 4. Some individual reviews have more than 40,000 downloads. Altogether, the whole series has over 200,000 downloads. The podcasts have over 12,000 downloads. And I'm proud of the fact that my colleagues at the American Academy of Neurology had a competition in 2019, and the competition was called the Brainstorm Competition. It was basically like that TV show Shark Tank, they invited some of us that are using technology to try to improve patient care in different ways to give a very short presentation on how we were doing that. And I won. So that was really nice. And the other thing is I have learned some really surprising lessons running this program for the past 12 years. The first group of lessons I've learned is about the products themselves. Now, some of them are real stinkers. And I can tell you that the worst of these products share in common what I would call red flags. So the things we've reviewed that got the lowest grades, these are some of the red flags that we found associated with them. And the way you can use red flags is if you're looking at something we haven't reviewed yet, you can ask yourself, how many of these red flags can you find associated with that alternative and off-label treatment? So some of the red flags are large out-of-pocket cost. Something that's unproven, something that's experimental, really shouldn't cost anything. We don't charge people to be in legitimate clinical trials when we're testing things in them. So you shouldn't have to pay tens of thousands of dollars for something that's not proven. Somebody who's advertising their product as effective for, dozens of the world's worst diseases that don't really share anything in common as far as their mechanism, that's a red flag. Somebody who doesn't have any kind of safety or scientific oversight. So they don't have any governing body like the FDA who's reviewed what they're doing. They don't have any institutional review board looking out for the safety of people that are being experimented on. That's a red flag. Somebody who doesn't really have any kind of informed consent. They're just asking you to hand over some cash and then they're going to experiment on you. Before they do that, there should always be a written document that you can look over to see exactly what you're getting into, which is a consent form. Somebody who's got something that really doesn't have a mechanism that makes any sense for treating ALS. Somebody who's doing something and then sending people on their way and never measuring what happens. And this is actually one of the most common red flags that we see, very commonly seen with some of the for-profit stem cell clinics around the world. You go, give them a bunch of cash, they inject you with whatever it is that they're calling stem cells, and they send you on their way, and they never actually measure what happened. The next is there's really no plan to ever present any information about this in a scientific meeting or in a publication. That's how science works. It works through something called peer review, where scientists can look over each other's work and provide helpful criticisms to make it stronger, to make it better. Somebody who's not participating in that has to be regarded with suspicion. The next is the only evidence of benefit is anecdotes. That's the weakest kind of evidence, stories of people who tried this and had something happen to them, because many times you can't even find that those people are real. The next is that the people offering this really don't have any relevant training. They've never presented at a scientific meeting. They've never published a paper in the ALS world. That's a red flag. And then finally, maybe the worst of all these is that the people selling this product are portraying themselves as victims and advertising that patients divorce themselves from their mainstream doctors. I always hate it when I see that. But the thing is, not all of these products fall into that category. Some of these products actually look quite promising to me, and I think warrant further testing. So some of these products have very plausible mechanisms for treating ALS, like acetyl L-carnitine, cannabis, curcumin, melatonin, methylcobalamin, protandim, resveratrol, tamoxifen, vinpocetine. Some of these have positive data from preclinical models. For example, positive data from our SOD1 mutant mice, acetyl L-carnitine, cannabis, curcumin, melatonin, resveratrol, tamoxifen. And believe it or not, some of these products actually have positive, though flawed, human trials. Acetyl L-carnitine, basis, curcumin, hyperimmune goat serum, L-serine, methylcobalamin, tamoxifen, and TUDCA are all AOTs that have been in trials of people with ALS and showed benefit. Another thing I learned that I was surprised by is that the progression of ALS is not a straight line. So I knew from the beginning of my career, I was taught that people with ALS progress at very different speeds. But I had no idea that the progression of an individual patient can speed up, slow down, stop, or even improve. And so I looked into this because there were a lot of products that seemed to be associated with some slowing of the disease. And I wondered, does that really mean that they're working? And so to try and answer this question, I went into a gigantic database called PROACT. It's a database where companies that have failed clinical trials, where the thing they were studying didn't show a benefit over placebo, donate the data from the trial to this database. And so it's information from large numbers of patients who participated in previous clinical trials. And I focused just on the people who had been on placebos. And I looked at a measurement called the ALS Functional Rating Scale. This is the main outcome measure that we use in clinical trials. Many of you know what this is. It's 12 questions that we ask. Each question is about a different part of the body. So for example, there's a question about speaking, and a question about swallowing, and a question about dressing and writing and feeding and walking and climbing stairs. Each of these questions is answered from 0 to 4. 4 means you're perfectly normal on that function, and 0 means you don't have any of that function at all. Now, if you look at a large number of patients, thousands of patients, on average, people with ALS lose about a point per month on that scale. But this is a trace in the upper right-hand corner of one person who was on a placebo in a clinical trial for 600 days. That does not look like linear progression. The progression is all over the place. In fact, from day 400 to day 550, it looks like they were completely stable. And then from day 550 to 600, they actually were recovering lost function. And so I asked this question in a different way. This graph down here shows the percentage of people in the whole database that had different degrees of ALS FRSR stability or improvement lasting different amounts of time. So if we just focus on this Duke blue curve, this is the percentage of people in the database who had a stable ALS FRSR lasting different amounts of time. So there's a lot of people whose ALS FRSR was stable for a short period of time, like 30 days, and there's not very many whose ALS FRSR was stable for 400 or 500 days. But nonetheless, you can see that it's kind of surprising. A fairly large number of people can have stable or even improving scores for short periods of time. That was a surprise to me. But maybe the biggest surprise of all is that there's some people out there who appear to completely recover from ALS. And so I've now found 53 people from all over the world whose medical records really suggest that they had ALS. They met today's diagnostic criteria. They progressed to where they were disabled, in some cases completely paralyzed and near death. And then they made dramatic, and in many cases, complete recovery of their lost motor function. And as a result of this surprising discovery made in the context of ALS Untangled reviews, I now have new research programs underway to try to understand these so-called ALS reversals, because I feel like if I can understand these, I might be able to make them happen more often. So the two programs, one is STAR, which stands for Study of ALS Reversals. And so in that program, I'm collaborating with that CREATE consortium to look at the genetics of these people. I'm collaborating with ALS TDI to look at RNA and protein biomarkers. I'm collaborating with Duke Neuroradiology to look at the imaging. I'm collaborating with the Duke Microbiome Center because there's a lot of interest now in the microbiome, the family of organisms that live in our guts, as a possible way to understand ALS progression. I'm collaborating with the CDC National ALS Registry to look at environmental exposures in these people. And I'm even collaborating with the NIH Neurobiobank in case someday, hopefully many years from now, these patients die from natural causes. I really want to look at their brains and spinal cords and compare what we see in there to people with more typically progressive ALS. And then the other program is called ROAR, Replication of ALS Reversals. It's possible that some of these people recovered because they found a regimen that worked, at least for them, a regimen of alternative and off-label treatments. And so in this program, I'm studying some of those treatments that are associated with ALS reversals. And these ROAR trials are very unusual because I'm looking for such a large signal, recovery from ALS, not just a slight slowing. I don't need to have a lot of inclusion-exclusion criteria. Just about anybody can be in one of these trials. Because I'm looking for such a large signal, I don't need a placebo. You know, if at the end of my trials, people who couldn't walk can walk again, I don't think anyone's going to consider that a placebo effect. I don't even need a lot of in-person visits. In fact, I probably don't need any. It's what I learned from the Lunison study is I can teach people to measure things in themselves and how to use a website called Patients Like Me and enter their measurements. And they will do it reliably and accurately, just as well as my coordinator can do it in my clinic. And so the first of these trials, unfortunately, did not show a benefit. That was of an AOT called Lunison that was associated with a very dramatic reversal of bulbar ALS. But the trial itself was a success because it showed that people really liked this unusual design. That trial had the fastest enrollment rate in the history of ALS, more than 9 patients per site per month. That trial had results available immediately in real time. And it was able to to get an answer about Lunison for a fraction of the cost of a more traditional clinical trial. And so I now have another ROAR trial that's enrolling, and that's of a product called Curcumin, which is a form of curcumin, a molecule found in many spices, including turmeric and curry powder. And so to just sort of summarize, what I've shown you is when it comes to these AOTs, there's a lot of interest. And like they used to say on the X-Files TV show, the truth is out there about these things, but it's not always easy to find. And so I've built ALS Untangled to systematically review these AOTs to hopefully help patients and families make more informed decisions about them. I do know that the reviews are popular, and I do know that I've learned a ton from this program, including gotten some ideas for new candidates for clinical trials, learned about the progression of ALS, that it's not linear, and that's changed the way I talk to patients now when I diagnose them. And finally, it's introduced me to people who appear to recover in some cases completely from ALS, which no one had ever taught me was possible. And I feel like if I could understand those cases, I might be able to make that happen more often. So I just want to thank a lot of people. I mean, first and foremost, people living with ALS. You're the reason I get up so early and continue to work until it's dark outside like I am tonight. You inspire me, and I really want to find things that help you. The ALS Association, that's our main funding source for ALS Untangled and a lot of the other work I do. My collaborators around the world, especially the ones at Patients Like Me, Neurobank, Origent, and all the reviewers from different countries who volunteer their time, and my Duke ALS care team. They helped me to build a foundation of great patient care upon which all my research is built. And so at this point, I'm going to take questions, and I'm going to start with some questions that were sent to me ahead of time. I've actually got some of these on slides. There were several questions that you sent me about cannabis. These are the questions, and I'll tell you what I know. So we did an ALS Untangled review on cannabis. It's a very complicated plant. So there are a lot of different kinds of cannabis, and each type, each phenotype contains a large number of very distinct chemicals. Those chemicals are called cannabinoids. The main cannabinoids are THC, cannabidiol, and cannabinol. And so in our ALS Untangled review, we thought it had a reasonable mechanism. Cannabis had a reasonable mechanism. We gave it a grade of C. So it turns out there's actually cannabinoid receptors in our brains. Those are called CB1 receptors, and also on the cells of our immune system. Those are called CB2. And one of the mechanisms by which cannabis could work as an ALS treatment is by binding to immune cells. It might modulate what we call neuroinflammation. And there's a lot of treatments that have been tried and are still being tried to modulate neuroinflammation in ALS. So that's very plausible. The other thing is that the chemical structure of cannabinoids, which is referred to as a terpene, is similar to another product we wrote an ALS Untangled review on, which is called tamoxifen. And I thought tamoxifen was actually one of the most promising things we ever reviewed. It's under study by somebody named Ben Brooks. But tamoxifen can block glutamate-mediated excitotoxicity, which is the way riluzole works. Tamoxifen can be an antioxidant, which is the way radicava works. Tamoxifen can also promote something called autophagy, which is a way that cells use to get rid of organelles and proteins that they don't want anymore. It's kind of like a garbage disposal. We gave it a preclinical grade of C, and that's because there are studies in the mutant SOD1 mouse model of ALS. They're not perfect, they have some flaws, but in general, the studies show that different forms of cannabis or ways to boost chemicals that we all have in our bodies called endocannabinoids can slow progression in that model. In terms of cases, we actually just recently upgraded this. Originally, when we wrote the article, we had 48 people on the website, Patients Like Me, that were taking many different forms and doses of cannabis and reporting a lot of things that improved speech, swallowing, secretions, fasciculations, appetite, sleep, and mood. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to find those people on Patients Like Me and get their medical records. But I do have this group, this growing group of ALS reversals, whose records I have. And 2 of these patients were on forms of cannabis during their recovery. Unfortunately, I still don't have great detailed information on the exact products and dosing, et cetera. I hope to find that. So in terms of trials on cannabis, well, there aren't any trials that looked at the progression of ALS. No published ones anyway. There are 2 trials that are enrolling patients with ALS. They're happening outside the United States. One's in Australia and one's in Canada. There is a trial, a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled crossover trial of THC, just one of the chemicals that is found in cannabis. And that was given at a low dose of 5 milligrams twice a day. Unfortunately, it didn't seem to benefit 27 people with ALS in terms of their cramps or their fasciculations or their sleep or their depression. It's a pretty small study, and it's probably not the ideal form of cannabis to study. Another study that I think used a more reasonable form, this was actually 2, a small duration trial and a small real world study where they just asked people who were using cannabis what they thought. This is all people that were using a spray form called Sativex. And Sativex is a mix of THC and cannabidiol. It's about a 50-50 mix. And in those 2 studies, there were benefits on spasticity. In terms of risks, we had to give this a U, meaning we're not sure. And the reason is there really aren't a lot of people with ALS who've been carefully studied on any cannabis product for very long. I told you about that Patients Like Me group, 48 people. They did report side effects, dry mouth, clumsiness, dizziness. One person reported a pneumothorax, a punctured lung. Not sure how that happened, but that's what they said, and a sore throat. There are now a lot of reviews starting to appear in the literature. And again, these don't include ALS because there's not much as far as ALS studies, but there was a systematic review across all indications, and it suggested benefits across a lot of different symptoms: chronic pain, spasticity, nausea and vomiting related to chemotherapy, benefits as far as weight gain in people with HIV, benefits in terms of insomnia in people with sleep disorders, and benefits in terms of uncontrolled movements and Tourette syndrome. So lots of benefits, but also there were a fair number of adverse events reported in these studies: dizziness, dry mouth, nausea, fatigue, somnolence, euphoria, vomiting, disorientation, drowsiness, confusion, loss of balance, and hallucinations. So getting back to the questions, the first person asked, is there a recommended ratio of THC to CBD to help fight cramping? Can it ease breathing? It helps me sleep. What cautions do people with ALS need to know, if any, with standard meds for ALS? And so, unfortunately, I did not find any trial showing that any form of cannabis can reduce cramps or shortness of breath in people with ALS. But I did tell you that I found a trial showing that forms of cannabis can help with pain. And one form in particular appears to help with spasticity, and that's that Sativex oral spray, which is about a 50-50 mix of THC to CBD. As far as what to watch out for, well, again, there seem to be a fair number of side effects reported in people in other trials. But again, I would caution you that we don't have a lot of experience with specific exposures in people with ALS. So I'm not aware of any interactions between any form of cannabis and the medicines that are commonly used to treat ALS, but just have to be careful because it's possible there's some interaction we don't know about since so few people have been carefully studied. Someone asked, what type of CBD is best? Is CBD with THC better? And is there some ideal strain to take to slow down disease? So again, the one form that's been beneficial so far for spasticity, that's a symptom in people with ALS, is this Sativex. There is no form of cannabis that has yet been shown to slow down disease progression in people with ALS. And then this one was, what can we do to get doctors to prescribe it and get it shipped from a reputable place? Well, first and foremost, we need studies, because we need to determine whether there's any form of cannabis that can really slow ALS progression. Now, thankfully, some of these are underway in other countries. In my opinion, the only way we're going to get more studies in the United States is we've got to work together to change the federal regulations on cannabis. You know, well, certain states, many states, in fact, have now legalized at least medical versions, and in some cases, recreational versions. As a federal government, the Drug Enforcement Agency still considers cannabis to be illegal, which makes it very, very difficult to study. So what I would say is, if we can get promising data from those studies that are happening in Australia and Canada, then we might be able to make this one of our platforms for National ALS Advocacy Day, to see if we can get an exception for cannabis products to be at least studied in people with ALS. And there is hope. There's a precedent for this. There is a cannabis product out there. It's cannabidiol oral solution, which, because it has data in rare, terrible childhood diseases called Dravet's, Lennox-Gastaut, and tuberous sclerosis complex, that is approved in every state and by the federal government to be prescribed to people with those specific conditions. So it is possible to do this, but we need the data first. So another question that came to me was about acupuncture. And this is one of those ones where, I first thought there's probably not going to be much here. And boy, was I wrong. There's quite a bit. And this is one of those things I'd really like to study in a trial someday. Acupuncture has plausible mechanisms for treating ALS. It actually can affect neuroinflammation. And there's data from that SOD1 mouse model, 2 different studies by the same group, that certain kinds of acupuncture might slow the progression of ALS. There's 2 case series published in peer-reviewed journals suggesting that people with ALS who had acupuncture progressed more slowly. And there's 1 open label trial. Now, the trial did describe benefits, but the trial had many flaws. And the benefits that were described were very odd. They were improvements in oxygen saturation, which is not typically something that I would think would be important, since most people with ALS have normal oxygen saturation to start with. Acupuncture is generally pretty safe. Mild adverse events can occur in like 7 to 11% of people, pain and bleeding. Very rarely, serious adverse events can occur. Somebody actually had a punctured heart from an acupuncturist. Somebody had a punctured lung, and there have been a few infections documented. So we had to give it a grade of D because of those serious adverse events. Any role for nicotinamide supplementation? Not much data, but any downside. So very plausible mechanisms. We haven't written about specifically nicotinamide, but I would give it a high grade for mechanisms. There is some positive preclinical data, so it's going to get a good grade. There are 2 confirmed ALS reversals on NAD containing supplements. One of them was on NAD itself, and the other one was on a product which is called Basis, which contains an NAD precursor and an antioxidant from blueberries, which is called pterostilbene. There is a trial of a product from the same company that makes Basis. This product is called EH301. Exactly how it differs from Basis is still not entirely clear to me. The company hasn't been willing to share that information with me, at least. So it's got the same ingredients. I just don't know if it's the same dose. It's a very unusual trial, very small, very short duration, only 32 people with ALS, only 4 months. But it did suggest some pretty substantial benefits. There are a lot of flaws with that trial, one of which is that it had a high dropout rate, and only the people who finished the trial were analyzed. So I understand now that the company has another trial underway, and hopefully this one will be a little more solid so that we can know for sure whether this product works. It does seem to be pretty safe. at least from a company standpoint. Some people get diarrhea. But again, I have to caution people that we don't have a lot of information about people with ALS on this treatment who are systematically followed for safety. This is one of my favorite questions. How do we evaluate the quality and reliability of over-the-counter supplements such as TUDCA? Well, in general, nobody takes the time or spends the money to compare the same supplement coming from different sources. When this is done, I can tell you that results can be quite shocking. Very often, what the bottle says is not exactly what's in there. And in fact, sometimes there's even potentially toxic things in some of these supplements like heavy metals. But I just don't know how we could incentivize people to do those kinds of studies more often. So when my patients ask, what I suggest is they either get their product of choice from the same supplier that's providing it for an active clinical trial, because in general, when it's being used for a trial, someone has done those kinds of comparisons and picked a reliable source. So for example, many of my patients are experimenting with L-serine, and the trials that are exploring that supplement get it from Jomar Labs, which does sell it to the public. The only other way I know of is to look at the star ratings on websites that sell products like Amazon. Now, why is that of any use? Well, I've ordered some supplements myself, and sometimes these supplements come and they're in a funny looking bottle, and I open it up and it didn't seem to be sealed in any way. And sometimes the pills that are in there aren't even the same color or the same size. So that's probably not going to get a very good star rating. At least, if you have a 5-star rating for a product, it looks legitimate, and that may be about as good as we can do until we can incentivize people to do these comparisons. Ketamine. Someone asked about ketamine, that their husband was prescribed a microdose for pain, but we've heard about an orphan drug trial that shows it can help ALS. So again, we haven't written about ketamine. It does have a plausible mechanism. It can block glutamate-mediated excitotoxicity. This is one we have to be a little careful about because it can have side effects. And these can range from minor to very serious. So anaphylactic shock, seizures, stopping breathing, addiction. These are side effects that have been seen in people without ALS. There aren't any available data that I could find on the internet or on PubMed from people with ALS. Now there's a company which is called PharmaTher, and they report that they're exploring a form of ketamine in preclinical ALS models, but I don't see any data on their website or published anywhere. And they mentioned on their website that this has been granted orphan drug status in preparation for a small trial in people with ALS. Now let's make sure we're all on the same page about what that means. Orphan drug status is not the same as a positive trial. So if a company has a drug, they can apply to the FDA for orphan drug status if they plan to test it in people with a condition that affects less than 200,000 Americans. So clearly, anybody that wants to study any product for people with ALS can apply for orphan drug status. They don't have to have any data on the product at all. But if they get it, it gives the company certain financial benefits, tax credits, exemption from certain FDA fees, increased years of market exclusivity if the drug eventually gets approved. So it's an attractive thing for a company to apply for, but it is not the same as a positive trial. What supplement should I take? Anything for indigestion? TUDCA's harsh. Can I get in the Amex, I think 0035 trial, even though I live in Canada? So, only you and your doctor can really decide what supplements are right for you. I did show you a slide earlier that shows you some of the supplements that ALS Untangled found promising, either as far as their mechanisms or their preclinical data, or even their trials. Those are some of the ones that I suggest to my own patients. Unfortunately, one of the most common side effects of any supplement, including TUDCA, is GI. And that can include indigestion, nausea, diarrhea. And I've not found any other treatment that can mask that side effect. Usually when people experience that, we just have to move on and try a different supplement. So as far as can you get in the new AMX0035 trial yet. Well, I haven't seen the details of exactly who's going to be allowed into that study, what countries are going to be involved, but I do know that it might soon be available by prescription in Canada and the United States. Now, this is one of my favorite things that's happened in many years. So many of you probably know the story that this drug was in a trial in 2019. The results looked very promising. It looked like it slowed progression on many different outcome measures above and beyond what riluzole does, because people in the trial were already on riluzole. And much to my dismay and many other people's dismay, the FDA said they would not accept that trial as an approval and that the company would need to go back and do a second trial before they would even consider it. Well, that resulted appropriately in a big backlash from doctors, scientists, patients. The backlash was initially directed at the FDA. There were some hearings. That didn't seem to change anything. And then the backlash was directed at Congress. And I think Congress put some pressure on the FDA as a result. And one of the things that we said was, if the FDA can creatively find a way to get COVID-19 vaccinations into people before they're officially approved, and they can creatively find a way to get an Alzheimer's drug called aducanumab into the hands of people with Alzheimer's before it's officially approved, why can't we use one of those creative pathways for this drug? And so I think it's probably been about 2 weeks ago now, the FDA actually came out and said, we've had second thoughts and we're going to reconsider this. So that's really good news. It might mean that we get one of those so-called conditional approvals where people can try this while we're waiting for the results of a confirmatory study. And then I think this is the last question that I got in advance. Why are the reversals with so many commonalities, B12, curcumin, seemingly downplayed by ALSA and ALS Untangled? Well, first let me say I don't think either group is really downplaying these. But it is important to remember that just because two things happened, one right after the other, does not mean that the first thing had anything to do with the second. Associations do not equal causality. I'm a Red Sox fan, and I've been wearing my favorite Red Sox shirt for the last 5 days, and the Red Sox have been terrible in spite of that shirt. And in the beginning of the year, they were fantastic, and I thought it was the shirt, but clearly it's not. The other thing I'll say is that some of the treatments that are used by ALS reversals, well, they're just commonly used treatments by anyone with ALS. So yeah, B12 was used by, I think it's 5 of the 53 ALS reversals, about 10%. At least 10% of the people that I've seen in my clinic who have more typically progressive ALS take some form of B12. So I'm not that excited that B12 has anything to do with these reversals. Now, there are some products, curcumin being the main one, that's much more commonly associated with an ALS reversal than it is with more typically progressive ALS. And rather than downplay that, I've spent the last 3 years of my life designing a protocol, getting funding, getting people under contract, getting approvals from the FDA and the IRB, and launching a trial of a form of curcumin called theracumin. So I'm certainly not downplaying that association. I'm working hard to try to figure out, is there any chance that that product reverses ALS in anyone? So let me take my slides off, and I suspect we may have some more questions coming in. I see some things happening in the chat box.
Yeah, we do. Thank you so much, Dr. Bedlack. Gosh, you were so kind to answer lots of questions that came in during registration and create slides for those. That was all awesome and chocked full of info. Yeah, we have just a few others that have been chatted in live. We have someone wondering if they're living perhaps in a more remote place like Hawaii, how could they participate in a trial?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, it would have to be a virtual trial. So theracumin would have been a great option. Unfortunately, it's only one trial that I know of that's set up exactly like that. And we got so many names so quickly that we're not really even taking names anymore. I have over 200 names, for the last 10 spots in the trial. So I would love to see more trials like that. If that's not possible, then I would like to see expanded access. And if that's not possible, then I hope that more people will publish their protocols online. Like with my ROAR program, I'm publishing my protocols on the ALS Reversals website. so that if a person wants to follow along and do exactly what we're doing, get exactly the same product, take it exactly the same way, they can, with their own doctor, follow the same outcome measures. They have that opportunity to do that. So it's not exactly being in a trial, but it's very similar because you're getting to do the same thing.
Great, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. Kind of a two-part question from the same person. Are there ways that you'd suggest ALS patients use your database to search for AOTs that might work? And kind of tagged on to that, saying cannabis has one of your red flags of being hyped for curing all sorts of illnesses. How do you suggest weighting red flags so we don't eliminate potentially useful materials?
Yeah, those are great questions. So I'll take the red flag one first. So just because it has one red flag doesn't mean it sinks the whole treatment, right? So there may be a treatment someday that a person who's never published before, never presented before, comes up with that might actually work. So if that's the only red flag, everything else about it looks great, that's fine. But I would say that the more red flags you see associated with something, the less confidence I would have that that would be useful. And as far as how to use ALS Untangled, well, one of the ways that I suggest to my own patients is I ask them, what kind of information is most important to you? Is it most important that it has a mechanism? Is it most important that it worked in a model? Is it most important that other people who tried it are having benefit? Are trials most important? Are risks most important? Are you most interested in trying things that are safer rather than taking on any risk? And then you can pick that column on the completed review section of the website. So say for you, it's cases. You're most interested in taking things that other people have taken where there might be some validated evidence that there's at least an association with improvement. Look for things that have a cases grade of A or B, and those would be things to focus on. So that's how I use it with my patients.
Okay, super. That's terrific. Another question about, do the alternative therapies for ALS work the same for PLS, or are there some that are better for PLS?
Yeah, super question. So what I would say is I believe progressive muscular atrophy, which is pure lower motor neuron disease, ALS and PLS are just really a spectrum of disease. I personally believe that this is all the same disease. And my evidence for that is that if you look hard enough over time in somebody who's said to have PLS, you very often find evidence that their lower motor neurons are not exactly normal. Sometimes it's years down the road that you do an EMG and you find some subtle abnormalities in their muscles. And progressive muscular atrophy is the same way. If you look at people who died from pure lower motor neuron disease, most of them have upper motor neuron involvement at autopsy, but we never saw it in life. So we couldn't call it routine ALS. We had to call it progressive muscular atrophy. And really the shame of that is that people on those ends of the spectrum are excluded from clinical trials. I hate that. And I'd love to see, trials be more inclusive, or at least, have a way to get expanded access programs that we could study people with these more extreme phenotypes to see if the treatments that work in people with typical early, rapidly progressive ALS, which is what most drug companies want to study, are those treatments at least safe in people with other types of ALS? Is there any hint that they're working in people with other types of ALS? But, getting back to the cannabis thing, the main problem that most people with PLS have is spasticity. And so that's actually one of the strongest bits of evidence for cannabis, particularly that Sativex form of cannabis is in spasticity. And acupuncture also has some really nice data that it might help spasticity.
Okay, great. And actually from that same person, she's asking, when we talked about acupuncture, if there's any particular type, sort of meaning best location to do the acupuncture.
Yeah. So I'm going to be honest, these acupuncture protocols are incredibly complicated. They tend to have unusual names. And if you take that ALS Untangled review into an acupuncturist and you circle the trials, the case series and the trials, most of the time the acupuncturist will know what those studies are and what those protocols are. So some of my own patients have taken those in there, and their acupuncturists worked with them on those exact protocols that were used in those studies.
Gotcha. Okay. What about contraindications or adverse reactions with cannabis and gabapentin or baclofen, if you know?
Yeah, so, getting back to what I said before, we have to be careful because these products have not been carefully studied in people with ALS. And so we may run into side effects that we didn't even know about.
Mhm.
I'll give you an example. We did a trial years ago of an antibiotic called minocycline. And it did a lot of things in test tubes and our animal model that looked really promising. And we were really excited about it. And we thought, well, this will be perfectly safe. I mean, it's been used in humans for decades for different things, including acne. It turned out that people with ALS had a very unfortunate and unique side effect to that. The people who got that drug, their progression was 25% faster than people on placebo.
Wow.
So for some reason, completely out of nowhere that we still don't fully understand, people with ALS had an accelerated progression on this drug. And so that's why I'm always careful to put these disclaimers in. But I would say you have to be careful of using multiple products that cause the same kinds of side effects. So sedation, the things you mentioned, the treatments for spasticity, gabapentin, baclofen, tizanidine, they all cause sedation. And so does cannabis. So I would just be really careful, if it were me, mixing multiple products that all can cause sedation.
Okay. Great. We've got a couple more here. Dr. Bedlack, thanks for taking the time. Someone saying they watched a movie with claims about lion's mane and Reiki mushrooms that might help repair neurons in the brain. Do you have any knowledge or research on these mushrooms?
We do. So we have that listed. That's on our list for a future review. What I can tell you so far is that it's going to be a tough review because lion's mane, it has a lot of ingredients, and it appears that the ingredients may be different from different suppliers. So I'm talking like hundreds of chemicals. So it's going to be a very difficult one to review as far as what each one of those chemicals might do and what formulation might be the best formulation. So at this time, what I can tell you is I have seen a handful of my own patients who took lion's mane. I have not seen any obvious benefit as far as their progression goes. So that's part of the reason it's very complicated and I haven't seen the benefit in my own patients. So that's part of the reason I'm not that excited about that particular alternative treatment.
Gotcha. And I know this question comes up a lot, asking about generic substances in AMX 35, if they could be purchased separately while waiting for US availability, if that's possible.
It's definitely possible. So AMX 0035 is a combination of two things. TUDCA, TUDCA, which is a mitochondrial stabilizer, a mitochondrial antioxidant, and sodium phenylbutyrate, which affects something called histone acetylation, which may change the pattern of genes turned on in cells, which may have a lot of positive downstream effects. So TUDCA by itself was shown to slow progression in a small European trial. And TUDCA by itself is under study in a larger European trial right now. So TUDCA by itself might work. Does sodium phenylbutyrate add anything to TUDCA? Short answer is we don't know. And I don't know if we ever will. I don't know if anyone is ever going to do a study comparing TUDCA to AMX 0035. I doubt it. And that's unfortunate because TUDCA is cheap. You can get TUDCA for about $70 a month at the dose that's in AMX 0035. That's just available without a prescription right on Amazon. Sodium phenylbutyrate is not easy or cheap. It is available by prescription. I've written a prescription for some of my patients. The cheapest I know of any of my patients finding it is $1,000 a month. So what I usually tell my own patients is, look, this is what we know about it. If it were me, I would probably try the TUDCA alone for a few months. And I would look to see if my progression was slowed on some of the measurements that we make together in clinic, like the ALS FRSR, the forced vital capacity, the hand grip dynamometry. Does it look like we've started to level out on TUDCA alone? If so, maybe you want to stick with that for a while. And if not, then we could consider adding the second ingredient that's much more difficult and expensive to get. At the end of the day, is that exactly the same as what's in AMX 0035? It may not be, because as we mentioned, different suppliers may have different purities, different additives, things like that. But for right now, it's the best that most people can do if they want to mimic what's in AMX 0035.
Okay, terrific. And I know we're running a little short on time. Couple more. The Sativex spray that you mentioned before, someone's asking if that's over the counter or prescribed.
Yeah, it's prescribed, but I don't think it's prescribable in the United States.
Okay,
I think it's only available in other countries.
gotcha.
Yeah.
And I love this question. If someone you know has ALS, what would be your top 3 AOT recommendations?
Yeah, so my number one recommendation is get into a good multidisciplinary ALS clinic where you can find somebody who's passionate about ALS, and you can find a team of therapists that will see you regularly, because there's just so many things that we can do to slow the disease down, to improve quality and length of life. And then, with that clinic, they may have their own sort of ideas about which AOTs are most promising. For me, I would say I'm a huge fan right now of Curcumin, again, because it has many mechanisms by which it could work. It's got some preclinical data. It's got 9 ALS reversals associated with that or something similar. It's got clinical trials. It appears to be very safe, very well tolerated. So that's probably number one for me. I would say number 2 for me is probably TUDCA, and that's because it has 2 clinical trials, one by itself and one with sodium phenylbutyrate. And then I would say there's a whole bunch of other ones. Probably I like L-serine next. It does have a positive open label study, and it's in a trial out of Dartmouth. But what I like the most about it is it targets a potential cause of ALS, a toxin called beta-methylaminoalanine. And I'm just of the belief that if we target causes, we have a chance for a much larger effect than if we target downstream events. So those are my top 3, but I've got a lot of other ones that I use with my patients if those don't work.
I love that question. I love that answer. I'm going to ask one final other quick question. Do you have information on X39 stem cell activation patches?
Nope, but I'll put that on my list for a future ALS Untangled review. That's not one that I've heard of.
Okay, I love it. I love the new findings out of this. Dr. Bedlack, we can't thank you enough for this. This has been amazing. It's been awesome. It's been information that our folks have not had necessarily before in this format. And we just really appreciate you joining us tonight. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Audra. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. And we're so grateful to all of you who participated for your time and commitment and being part of our community. Thanks again to our sponsors, including Team Select Home Care. I want to invite you to, as we wrap up tonight, to save the date for a couple of upcoming chapter virtual events. The Walk to Defeat ALS is on October 23rd, and it's the #1 way for us to unite as a community to fundraise and build awareness for those living with ALS. Whether you plan to walk, hike, bike, roll, swim, or just picnic with your family, please join us in honor, in memory, or in support. You can find all these details at walktober.org. Couple other quick things. The next installment of our Ask Me series will be on Tuesday night, November 9th. And we invite you to join us also for our Champions for Cures and Care on Thursday, November 18th. In addition to the information provided tonight, the Golden West chapter offers free resources you can find online, including a free estate planning guide. And as you know, philanthropy fuels everything we do, and some people choose to support the chapter's programs through an estate or planned gift. If you wish to learn more about that, please visit our website at give.alsagoldenwest.org, and please watch for the short survey on tonight's presentation that will have a link of the presentation tonight, and you'll receive an email in order to help us plan for future educational programming. Thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.